Hi, today we're continuing with Module 3 and we're looking at Lesson 5, the opposite of a number's opposite. And I promise you by the end of the lesson you'll be thoroughly annoyed and sick of hearing me say the word opposite, because I will say it about 10,000 times. Okay, a lot of times we think of opposites, think of double negatives. I didn't do nothing. If it's not nothing, it's something. Double negatives are not good when it comes to the English language. The example I showed in class is if I'm walking in one direction, then I go in the opposite, direction, I ended up going in the same direction that I started with. Okay, so now exercise 1 is just a review of what we worked on yesterday. So we're going to start by locating number -2 on the number line and its opposite. The opposite of -2 is +2 because they are both the same distance away from 0, but on opposite sides. So number 2 wants an integer that represents each of the following. Not the opposite, just the integer. So 90 feet below sea level would be -90. $100 of debt would be -100. 2 degrees Celsius above 0 would be a +2. Okay, that's all you had to write. But now for number 3, it's going down. All right, number 3, let's take a look. Joe's my kind of guy. He's hanging out at the ice cream shop. And his house is 10 blocks north of the shop. The park is 10 blocks south of the shop. When he is at the ice cream shop, is Joe closer to the park or his house? How could the number 0 be used in this situation? Okay, so first of all, if we're talking about north and south, should I be drawing a horizontal number line or a vertical number line? A vertical, and I only see one person, I think, that did that. Okay? So we're going to draw a vertical number line. Now, we're going to start our number line at 0. What would 0 be? What is the starting point? What is the starting point for Joe?
The shop.
Alright, so we're starting at the ice cream shop. Now, 10 blocks north would be positive is his house. And then 10 blocks south is the park. So now, if Joe is at the ice cream shop, what would be closer? What's closer, going home or going to the park? What would be closer for him? They're both the same distance away from the ice cream shop. They're both 10 units or 10 blocks away from where he is. So what can we say about the house and the park because they're both 10 blocks away? Right, the house and the park are opposites because they're both the same distance from 0. Okay? So now that we have a good understanding of what an opposite is, let's continue. What is the opposite of 8? So first of all, what number is 8 units to the right of 0? Everybody? 8. So what is the opposite of 8? -8. All right, so here we were at 8. And the opposite is -8. All right. So now I have -8 as the opposite. So now I want to find the opposite of that. So what is the opposite of -8? +8. So what did we notice about the opposite of an opposite? We had 8, and then -8, and then 8. Right, so the number is itself. It's the same number. Like when I was walking, And when I did the opposite of the opposite, I ended up walking in the same direction. So then you're going to put your pencils down and we're just going to talk about it for a minute. Whenever you see that symbol, that dash, that symbol means the opposite of a number. So here we have the opposite of 5, which is 5. Okay? Since the opposite of 5 is negative 5, and the opposite of negative 5 is positive 5, the opposite of 5 is 5. So what is the opposite of negative 6? What is the opposite of 10? 10. How would you write the opposite of 12? Everybody? What does this symbol mean? What is the opposite of a debt of negative 12? Negative 12, because a debt is negative 12. So the opposite would be 12, and then the opposite of that would be negative 12. Would bring us right back. So in general, the opposite of a number is the original number. It's back to itself. Okay? Now you're going to try it. At your desk, there are 4 cards. 4, 150, negative 6, negative 9. Everybody's going to take a card, and you're going to work with your partners to find the opposite of the card, and then the opposite of the card. Okay, let's go over this. The opposite of 4, you would write it as the opposite, and then you put the number inside the parentheses. So that way you know it's not negative 4. Because if you just wrote the sign and then the 4, it would be negative 4. So the parentheses are telling us the opposite of positive 4, which is negative 4. So the opposite of negative 4. So we took this negative 4, and now that's here inside the parentheses, because I want the opposite of that number. So the opposite of negative 4. And this is what you should be writing in your tables and fixing them. So the answer would be 4. So for 150, you would write it as the opposite of 150, which equals 150. So now you're going to take that negative 150, and we want to find the opposite of that. So the opposite of negative 150 equals positive 150. So do you see why you need those parentheses there, so you can tell the difference between the opposite or if it's a negative? So now for number 6, we want to find the opposite of negative 6. If it helps you to think of the parentheses as of. So the opposite of negative 6 equals positive 6. So now we're going to find the opposite of positive 6, which is negative 6. So now the opposite of negative 9 equals positive 9. So now we'll take this 9, and we want to find the opposite of 9, and that equals negative 9. You got a question?
Why do you need the parentheses?
So that you know that it's not a negative symbol, that you're looking for the opposite of. Because remember, the dash means opposite. So the parentheses is kind of like our operation symbol. That means finding the opposite of. Notice it's not in our answer. So that's how we're writing it as an equation. The parentheses are helping us write it as an equation. It's almost like you could write 2 times 3 equals 6. So the opposite of 6 is negative 6. So this is my equation. That's my equation.
So the dash means opposite?
Yes. Yep. Okay. So that's, you use the parentheses to write it as an equation. parentheses will not appear in your answer, in your equation. All right, so now let's think about it. Write the opposite of negative 10 as an equation. You ready for this one? Yeah, you gotta be paying attention. You ready? I'm about to blow your mind. Ready? 2 feet on the floor. Pull in your chairs. Sit up straight. Shoulders back. Head up. Eyes up here. Okay. So, yes, you have to smile. So, first of all, we want to find the opposite, my alignment's off here, of negative 10. So, to find the opposite of negative 10, let's write that first step as an equation. So, here, I'm doing my first step. My marker's all off here. So, the opposite of negative 10, that means opposite. Opposite of what? Negative 10. So, that was my first step. So far, so good? But now I want to find the opposite. Oh, which was what? What is the opposite of negative 10? 10. Now I'm going to do my second step and find the opposite of that. So now, the opposite of 10. I'm going to write it like this. The opposite of 10. And what does the opposite of 10 equal? Negative 10. Yes, you're writing this now because we're writing out the steps, okay? So, now we're going to, so this is technically, this is our answer, okay? That's our answer. Well, we're going to put that all together as one equation. Are you ready? So what number did we start with? We started with negative 10, correct? We wanted to find the opposite of that. So the opposite of negative 10. So that was the first step. Now we're going to find the opposite of that. So we need to find the opposite of that. I'll do it again. Everybody watch. What was my first number? Negative 10. What did I want to do to negative 10? Find the opposite. So how do I write find the opposite as an equation? I put parentheses around it. So that was my first step, right? That's what I did here. That was my first step in blue. But now that, what's there? I want to find the opposite of that. So how do I write the opposite of that? So basically, I'm going to look at that now as a whole number. Wait, highlighter. So now I'm going to look at this as a whole number, if that helps. I need to now find the opposite of that. Really? And now I'm just going to put another set of parentheses around it to close it all up. So the opposite, ready, follow along, the opposite of negative 10 equals negative 10. You should be writing that down. Do you have a pencil you can borrow? Does anybody have a pencil you can borrow? His pencil broke. Thank you. So in general, the opposite of a number is the original number. Okay? So now we're going to try to find a real-world example of this. Let's use sea level. That's pretty easy. So let's write this down. The opposite I told you I was going to say this word a lot. Go home and watch the blog. Count how many times I said opposite. The opposite of the opposite the opposite of the opposite let's do 100 feet below sea level. Let's fit it in there. Okay, so 100 feet below sea level we would write as negative 100. So far, so good? So now let's start finding our opposites. So the number that I have right now is negative 100. That's the number that I have. What I want to do is find the opposite of that number. So to find the opposite of that number equals 100. So now this is my new number. I now have 100. So I'm going to take 100 and now find the opposite of that. So what is the opposite of 100? Negative 100. So our final answer would be negative 100. So let's take a look at our closing. We're not done. Binder should not be closing up. Giving everybody a second to finish copying this down. So to summarize what we discussed today, what is the opposite of a number? What is it? Itself. It's the original number. So the opposite of negative 6 is negative 6. So what is the relationship between the location of a non-zero number? That means any number except 0. So what is the relationship of any number except 0 on the number line and the location of its opposite on the number line? So what do we know about a number and its opposite and where they're located on a number line? What do we know about that? Exactly. A number and its opposite are always the same distance away from 0. Why did they say non-zero number in here? Why did they write non-zero number?
Because maybe let's say,
Why not 0?
like 10.
Why couldn't we use 0? Why couldn't we use 0? Any number except 0, that's saying. Why couldn't we use 0?
We'll always get 0.
Well, because 0, what's the opposite of 0?
0.
0. So it can't be equal distance from 0 if it is 0. The opposite of 0 is 0. So that's why they specified any non-zero number, because 0 has its own rules, okay? Tonight's homework is all of problem set for lesson 5.